ESG.
Yeah.
It's very new for me.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. Like I have limited knowledge, and
Sure.
this is like something completely new for me. It is called environment, social, and governance.
Governance, yeah. What does it mean?
Yeah, like could you explain to me and everybody? Like, let's start from this, if that's completely fine with you. Like,
Absolutely.
what is ESG?
ESG, so you explained the three words, right? The three alphabets, right? So the environment bit of it, a lot of the action that is currently happening is around creating a regulatory mechanism which allows us to at least be able to gauge what our environmental impact is.
Yeah.
So a company which is doing cement production, for example, will have it's an extractive industry, right? It takes something out, it mixes something up, and then it creates something for you to build with, right? Whereas if you think about an FMCG company, it has a large dependency on water, for example, right? The extraction of water. If you don't stabilize water supply in the future, today there is data enough to support that particular company will feel the impact of having lesser water, lesser quality of water, and as a consequence, its bottom line is going to get affected. So today, over time, today there is sufficient data which supports the idea of the risks that businesses will face medium and long term if they don't assume a certain level of efficiency and sensitivity towards the environment. And this will be more in some industries, it will be less in other industries. And it's the same, by the way, it's the same debate with the fossil fuel industry, right?
Yeah, at the moment.
Yeah, at the moment. So if the fossil fuel industry does not begin to start investing in their net zero journey, which is the big debate today, right? If I'm not mistaken, I think Nepal's target is 2050 for net zero.
Yeah.
PwC's target is 2030. And so if you look at us as a company, most of our carbon is because of travel, right? How do you reduce that? So we've become part of the carbon markets, for example. So we mitigate some of our flying by investing in credits, which then invest in communities that are actually changing and transitioning into a non-fossil fuel-based idea.
Give me an example.
The problem with that is, if I'm telling a small farmer that, look, you live on the border of Chitwan National Park, and you're extracting wood because you need to burn your chula, right? If I don't give them an option, another viable option, they will keep extracting. What will happen? My wood becomes lesser. My forests begin to deplete, right? And my biodiversity, therefore, gets affected. And therefore, carbon sequestration and all of those things get adversely impacted. So today you have a design, for example, for a smokeless chula. It has two benefits to it. One is it uses lesser wood. So where you were using maybe 100 logs of wood, this allows you to use maybe 40. So as a consequence, you've already reduced it. That's one level. And the second is it also impacts the health of the family because typically it is the women who are the ones responsible for nutrition within rural households. But the amount of smoke that goes into their system causes for health hazards to happen over a period of time, which then become generational. What does that do? It creates more impact on your health system. And so if I have more women getting more ill over a period of time, the pressure on an already pressurized healthcare system will become that much more. So they're all interconnected. Right?
Exactly.
And so sometimes when we create solutions, and pardon me for saying this, but when we create solutions, we're doing surface level solutions which are not looking at the interconnectedness and the interdependencies between issues. So huge debate around the SDGs, right? It's been around for a while now. But when people look at the SDGs, you can't look at the 17 SDGs in isolation because they're all connected to each other.
It's like a web.
Correct. So if I'm looking at education, to use the example that I did earlier, I can't look at education, especially in the rural context, without looking at livelihood, right? And if 70% of my country is supported livelihood-wise by farming, if I don't affect farming to become more efficient, the entire chain gets impacted as a consequence, right? So these interdependencies and interconnectedness is where I think we have fallen a little behind in terms of the actions that need to be taken post-policy. We have good policy in most parts of the world. It's just that the implementation of that policy historically has always been considered to be the responsibility of government and civil society. We today know that they don't have the capacity and capability to do so. They are very important stakeholders, don't get me wrong. They still have to do a lot when it comes to the scale side of it. But if the private sector, for example, is not involved, the skills that are needed, the investment that is needed, the efficiency that is needed will not come to the table.
I'll switch to something completely different. I'll just touch base on this. We have two major airports, recently developed airports now. We have 3 international airports. We have 3, and then two of them were just recently we went ahead and finalized it. It's already commencing. And then now the government's thinking of doing a partnership with the private sector model. So hopefully that's something that's definitely going to go ahead and work out down the road. So like you just said, without working with the private sector, it's almost, almost next to impossible for countries like ours where we're still developing?
I think it's in some senses even more important for countries that are developing because we don't have the same time as those that industrialized 100 years ago. It's as simple as that, right? Time is short. The issue with the time is short part is that when you're looking to make a leap in terms of your transition, what do you need most? You need financing and you need technology.
The skill set.
Yeah, and it comes back to that same argument of climate, right? If global companies and Western institutions are not going to support technology transfer across sectors to happen, then they are only paying lip service, right? They need to be able to support patented technologies, which today the patents are kept with the Western world, and pass those on and create a financing mechanism which actually allows for then the execution of some of those technologies to happen in the context of our world. Our world in Nepal, for example, where you have the most beautiful Himalayan ecosystem, extremely important as you think about the biodiversity equation for the region. It's not just important for Nepal. This is important for the entire Himalayan landscape and all the countries that won't touch it. But in some senses, the Western Himalayan ecosystem is as important from a global perspective as the Amazon is.
Yeah.
We have just not given it importance. And that's it.
Yet.
Today I think the voice of the global south is becoming that much stronger. And as a consequence of that voice geopolitically becoming that much stronger, people are beginning to listen and take notice far more. Why is that partially the reason? Because a lot of the growth for the world is going to come from the global south, right? So if you think about the Western world, you've had a plateau happen when it comes to GDP growth to a certain extent. So where are the consumers? The consumers are all in this part of the world, right? Where is the GDP growth happening? Where is industrial growth happening? But if you want that industrial growth to happen in a sustainable way, you got to create the technology transfer mechanism and you have to create financing options which allow for those countries, those companies to be able to access those technologies and then to work with them. Because it's not a one-size-fits-all. What will work in southern Canada, even though it might be a partially mountainous region, may not necessarily work in the Himalayan context.
True.
Right?
True.
There will be some similarities, but that last 20-30% is what is going to be.
We have to go ahead and customize it according to how we can go ahead and use it. Just touching base on this, except I'm just saying this is my personal opinion, except defense, majority of the other patents, maybe if the Western world can share it down the road in coming decades, that would be something that is going to be useful for developing countries like us?
Immensely useful. It's happened before. If you look at in the 70s and 80s, what happened in the pharmaceutical industry with the generics manufacturing, that means these were the copycats, right, to some extent. Part of the reason that the developing world was able to provide some of these pharmaceuticals to its people was because they were not part of the WTO regime, which then only limited patented companies which had the patents to produce. Why did India become one of the largest generics manufacturers in the world? It became so because we were not a signatory to the WTO.
Give me a ballpark figure. When did this happen? In the 70s?
This is in the late 70s, yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And I mean, if we did not do generics manufacturing in the way that we did, the cost of pharmaceuticals for the developing world
skyrocketed.
Yeah, would be inaccessible to most of our populations, right? And the Western world for many years pushed back on that a hell of a lot. But it was one of the places in which actually the global south came together. And I use it as a classic example as I think about today in the future in terms of being powerful enough to be able to ask for the rights that you deserve, right? In the context of appropriateness. I'm not asking for any more. What I'm asking for is an equitable mix of the way that you look at how we are in the world where we are today. And the same way the industrialized nations, without thinking about the climate, only thinking about the self, were able to drive their political and economic agenda for the last 100 years, we are saying if you want us to be more sensitive, help us be more sensitive, because you have the ability to do so. If I had the ability to do so, I would, right? Because that's the right and moral thing to do, because after all, we are one world and we are one family in so many ways. And so for us who are neighboring countries, for example, so many of these things are interdependent and interconnected. So if we don't look at this in a cohesive way, find places of common ground versus things that separate us, I'm not sure it's the right world that we want to leave for the people who are going to come after us.
And at the end of the day, we cannot go ahead and we don't choose our neighbors.
Absolutely.
We don't choose our neighbors, and we don't have a choice rather than being friends with our neighbors.
Absolutely right. And it's not just neighbors today, right? I think you need to go
beyond that.
Beyond that, because again, if you think about global supply chains and what happened, we were speaking about COVID earlier, right? I mean, if you think about what happened to global supply chains on the most essential of goods during COVID, especially in the early time when, shipping took the hit that it did, it impacted the whole world. If you think about what has happened as a consequence of grain not flowing from Russia and from Ukraine, and the impact that that's having on some of the lesser developed parts of the world and vulnerable communities across the world, it's massive, right? So the amount of interdependencies that we have in the world that we live today, in a globalized world that we live today, there's no option for us but to have a collaborative approach and collaborative action, not just thinking, but action too. And it's that action for which, in some senses, I'm in Nepal to work with the private sector in Nepal as we think about the challenges climatically that Nepal will face in the not-so-distant future. This is not something that's going to come in the next generation.
It's going to happen right here.
It's sitting in our courtyard as we speak.
I'm going to go ahead and touch base a little bit of what the Foreign Minister of India had said some time ago. And I just don't want to quote him directly, but what he had said was, at the end of the day, I'll think for my people. I remember during a conversation he had during an interview, he said, I'm going to think about my people. I'm going to think about what's the best for my people at the end of the day. And agreeing to that, obviously, on today's day, thinking of our people right here, we're sitting in Kathmandu, we're sitting in Nepal, what would be, just as a suggestion, what would be things that we could go ahead and do as soon as possible to go ahead and reduce the risk? Because this is the generation that's going to go ahead and face a lot of things that's about to go ahead and hit us, right? Earlier you said reduction of paper. This is something that I'm going to take as an example. Anything else you want to go ahead and add on, right in the get-go when it comes to climate?
I think so. Just to take from what the Foreign Minister said, and I couldn't agree with him more, because I think part of what he's suggesting is the general idea of all humankind being based on self-interest, right? I think he's only speaking about it from a country context. So and it's a really important point, because look, if the benefit is not seen by you and me, simple citizens, right, we have no propensity to change. We don't want to change, right? So if you don't show me the benefit, and that's for us who, have the ability to sit under an air conditioner. There are so many of our men and countrymen and women who don't have that ability. And for them, self-interest manifests in a very different way. So I think just to ask, go after the example that you're suggesting, there are many things that Nepal can do. There are many things that Nepal is doing. I think one is the responsibility of media to sensitize far broader populations, make them understand in some senses how it's going to impact them. 15 years ago, it was very hard to explain to a farmer what climate change meant. Today, I can tell you go to a lot of farmers globally, ones that perhaps have not gone through even a formal education system, for example, they are seeing the effects of climate change manifest in their yield. What happens? It affects their yield, it affects the quality of their crop, and it affects the amount of the crop that's going to come out. And what does that impact? That impacts the amount of money coming into my pocket. very, very real. I can go and give them as much gyan as I'd like to. That's not going to make them change. But the fact that the yield is lesser and there's lesser money in my pocket, which is going to affect the health, education, nutrition of my family, that's what's going to make me change. So if you don't in some way or form impact that positively, behavior is not going to change. We all have to understand this. In the case of Nepal, I think just in terms of examples, there are many things. What I've seen happen, for example, with your electric car space, right? Electrification.
Short span of time.
I mean, it's amazing. The last time I was in Nepal was 4 months ago. This time I've come, the amount of dealerships that I'm seeing in the electric space have gone through the roof. And as I think about Nepal as a context, landlocked, doesn't have its own fossil fuels, imports everything, right? For a country like that, for a country like Nepal, to just make that transition happen and make it happen at the pace that it is, and you're endowed with amazing hydroelectric infrastructure, which you will continue to invest in.
Yeah.
So if you think about the power coming from there, and then the development of the EV sector, and those two coming together, that's a really powerful solution for the future. And a space which, if you impact it positively, will drastically, positively impact the lessening of carbon into the environment.
And we'll be net zero hopefully before 2050.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think there is a private sector example in itself. I think the second piece is a somewhat more broader piece, which is part of the adaptation report that we have partnered with CNI on. Is look, there are the risks are well known. The structures to some extent within government already exist. Now, how do you take some of those structures, bring all the stakeholders onto the table, and create an action-oriented mindset? Enough talk has happened, right? We need to now take very bold steps towards action. And it's those actions that we're recommending through this report as well. Not just saying that government needs to do this, or media needs to do this, or private sector needs to do this. It has to be collaborative. Everybody has to be a part of that solution as I think about the future. And if we don't do it in that way, and one of those cogs actually misses out, you're not going to have a cohesive, sustainable solution for the future. And in that, the most important are citizen-led movements as well. The same point, if I don't go down to that farmer, understand the context of that small farmer in the Terai, and I'm able to convince that farmer that by doing this, you will see a benefit in a very short to medium span of time, and create that resilience in a changing environment for the future, and make him understand that person, that family has no need for change. So solutions are available, financing mechanisms, technology need to come in a far bolder way. A collaborative platform, civil society, media, government, the private sector need to come together with an action-oriented mindset, so that what we're doing very quickly is taking some of the solutions that are available, contextualizing them to the context of Nepal, which has its own uniquenesses, own opportunities, own challenges, and then act on them. We got to stop talking and we got to start acting.
Right now, I'd just like to go ahead and ask you something which might be relatable to what we're talking about, might not be related to what we're talking about. We love adapting things. Like your examples of EVs, I can go ahead and give you examples of smartphones as well. We've adapted the smartphone we've adapted the complete network of digitization when it comes to smartphones here in Nepal. Right now, role models are very important. I believe in role models. Looking at, let's say, if the Prime Minister goes ahead and does something which is going to go ahead and positively impact the society, people, especially kids, probably are going to go ahead and look up to that. I mean, if the Prime Minister is doing it, then maybe I'm going to go ahead and do it. Right? It might be something like just going ahead and picking up a piece of paper and throwing it in the garbage.
Yeah,
it might sound so minute, but it's impactful.
Yeah.
How has India, I'm just going to touch base on India, what are the things that India has gone ahead and done, especially when it comes to role models going ahead and acting on it in media's perspective? Just if you could touch base on this.
I'll start with actually using your example, since you mentioned the Prime Minister. One of the marquee things that our Prime Minister did when he first took office was something known as the Swachh Bharat campaign.
Narendra Modi.
Correct.
Okay.
And it's very interesting you use the example of role model. And when I see people that I respect doing something which is not normal for me to see, right? And it's interesting that our Prime Minister, and you'll see some of this online when you search for it, actually has, quite recently, there's a day that he spends cleaning the roads, right? And this is put on to our media, and our media circulates that. And the reason is exactly the reason that you just mentioned. Now, there's the leader of the country who's creating that example, one type of role model in the political space. My argument is that it needs to go even beyond that. We need to find many types of role models, right? Politicians are one type of role models, the ones who lead countries. We need role models in the private sector. We need role models in media. The amount of space that you will give through the medium that you have to the important subjects of society will have you be a role model in the media context. So I think role models are also a matter of context. And I think that the ones that have the most amount of reach are, of course, politicians and the leaders of respective countries. But there are some very good ones there. So in India's case, I just gave you this example. But climate champions, for example, right? We have so many from people who are 9, 10 years old to people who are 70, 80 years old. I'll give you an example, maybe somewhat trivial, but I hold it very close to my own heart. My mother, many years ago when I was much younger, would take a napkin. So if you look at a typical napkin, right, it's quite big. Right? I'm not talking about a typical tissue box, but if you a napkin in a paper napkin in a restaurant. But if you actually look at that napkin, you can probably tear it into 2 or 3 pieces and make 2 or 3 people use it. Now, many years ago, my mother used to do this on our personal, in public she would never do it, but now I'm saying this publicly, but she would never do it in public. But at home, she was very conscious about this from a mental model of saving. She came from the idea of saving. It wasn't climate, it was saving. Right? But its impact was very much 15 years later. She is one of my climate champion role models because even though she was doing it for a different reason, she understood the worth of saying, this is too much. I can probably do with a little lesser, right? And achieve the same result, right? Yeah. So, I'm giving you a role model of the leader of my country, and I'm giving you a role model of somebody in my own household, And we have these all around us. The simple example that you just took of saying, if I have somebody I respect and I see them just doing something so basic as not throwing their litter out of the window of their car, but retaining it. And for that, there might be something in the car in which you can put it. And then you go and get rid of it somewhere. What better role model could you have? So I think it's about promoting different types of role models. Yesterday, I had the pleasure of being at your ISL football game last evening.
NSL, yeah.
NSL, yeah. I was at the football game. One, the quality of the football was excellent, firstly. So congratulations to all of you for whoever are promoting that particular league. But as I thought about, sport makes some of the biggest role models on the planet.
True.
So how do you take sportsmen? How do you take people who are great mountaineers, right? The Sherpa community is known globally from Nepal, right? How do you take some of that community and make them become a part of the debate? And if you think about it, the regions that they impact and where they've made their name is one of the places that climate change is impacting the most. The receding of glaciers is going to affect that community. So I think role models are many. I think it's about being able to take those role models, bringing it closer to the context of simple people, of normal people, and then being able to talk about them. That media needs to give the space for a lot of these stories to get out. I'm not so sure that the headlines, for the most part, capture the issues of today outside of the conventional stuff that media typically goes after.
True. I'm going to agree with you. And if we really push, it's something that, I'm a big believer that everything needs to start from home. And the example that you gave about your mom, again, that's perfect because I'm a true believer. It all starts from your home, probably from your office, regardless of how big or small it is. Absolutely. And then you gradually grow into the other sectors of society. Jaivir, could you tell everybody that when was the first time you came to Nepal?
It's a really. I'm embarrassed to some extent, but one, I'm a great lover of Nepal, right? I've had some very interesting connections because my grandparents used to be very avid climbers. In fact, from my maternal side, my maternal grandmother's brother spent a lot of time in Nepal because he's an Everester.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. And so I had this connection, but I also have a great love for the outdoors. So it was very curious that pretty much all of the mountains in India I've been to, and I'd never been to Nepal. And my first introduction to Nepal, unfortunately, was through an unfortunate event, which was the big earthquake. And I arrived here maybe 3 days after the earthquake happened. And then, of course, did work in Nepal on the humanitarian response side for 3 years after that, right? So, I mean, in those first 24 months of post the earthquake, I must have been in Nepal about 20 times. So I was here pretty much every month, right? So yeah, I mean, it's been what, 7-8 years? When was
2015?
15. So it's been 8 years since the first time I came, and since then, I mean, there isn't a year that I've missed. So I've come here, done lots of work with the private sector here, had the opportunity to engage with some of the political leaders as well, but on subjects around, the humanitarian development space, because that's what's very close to my heart and where I believe that the private sector has a very large role to play and has not played the role that it should responsibly play. Nepal is a very easy place to fall in love with, and it's not just a place, because the place is made by the people. And, having traveled, having had the blessing of traveling in most parts of the world, there are very few communities and people that I've come across who are as resilient. They go through crisis, they wake up the next morning, they pick it all up, and they just go for it. And that's one of the beauties of this culture, that you have this great ability to take on adversity, like, head on. And it's not recognized that much, especially when you live it every day. You don't sit back sometimes and think about it.
No.
but it is an amazing, amazing, amazing quality, and one that endears people, I think, to this part of the world.
First of all, I'd like to go ahead and say thank you so much. And this is home. And I hope you call it home forever.
Well, if you let me, if all of you will let me come back, I'll keep coming back. But
no, keep coming back forever and ever. And first of all, I want to go ahead and thank Nirvana for introducing us yesterday, and I'm glad that you're here. Tell everybody a little bit about PricewaterhouseCoopers and also the India Foundation of it, and how. Have we come together? Especially you were talking about 2015, right? How did we come together, and what are the things that you are working here when it comes to PwC? Yeah,
so I mean, PwC. I mean, I drive. I'm on the non-commercial side, so I do three things essentially in PwC. I lead the PwC India Foundation. Most of its programs are in India, outside of the Nepal intervention, because Indian foundations can only work within the Indian national boundaries. But in the case of Nepal, the Indian government allowed a special dispensation for Indian foundations because of the special relationship, allowed Indian foundations to work in Nepal. So at that time, the PwC India Foundation, being an Indian legal entity, could work in Nepal. Otherwise, typically, you're not allowed to do so. And so that in those early days when we came, it was all about coming and understanding the context, understanding who are the people who are willing to invest alongside you. And, you mentioned Nirvan earlier. I mean, the CG Group partnered with us at that time. We built homes. I did work with Beer Hospital. We did water and sanitation programs because the monsoon was about to be upon us. Road infrastructure was going to be affected, so there was a timing equation associated with it.
Everything had to be fast.
Everything had to be fast. Yeah, exactly. So I think we did some very substantive work where it wasn't just about us coming in, sort of using global benchmarks to be able to do the right thing. It was also about learning. I mean, the amount of things that I learned here, the power of a private sector distribution network, right, of the kind that CG had because of its FMCG business. It's one of the cases that I make globally, that you had a large private enterprise who was willing to come to the table and say, okay, teach us. Otherwise sometimes as we were discussing earlier, the propensity for change is very limited within systems. But I mean, kudos to Mr. Chaudhary, Senior, who essentially said, my system is available. Tell us what we need to do, how we need to do it, and we will bring that to the table. And that in itself was amazing. So for us, I mean, we started with that, but then, moving on from there, we've continued to do lots of work in Nepal, but also beyond. One of the things that I do for PwC globally is that I drive humanitarian programs in protracted crisis. So, not the typical places that you might expect PwC to be operating in, and commercially we don't. So everywhere from Afghanistan to Syria to Turkey,
Bangladesh, for instance.
Bangladesh, we have one of the oldest programs in the largest refugee camp in the world in Cox's Bazar.
Yeah.
Almost 250,000 footfalls in our 2 little healthcare camps that we run there. So it's part of PwC's intent to do that was taking on the fact that the private sector has a far bigger responsibility than we have assumed, perhaps historically. And for me, that's been a really big revelation in some senses, because private companies were not typically used to doing stuff like this. But think about it this way. PwC is, over 350,000 people in sort of 170 countries across the world. Think about any type of skill set, width and depth is available within that system, right? So you've got some of the smartest people on the planet, but their day-to-day is servicing a particular type of idea, which is usually sort of commercially associated. And for me, the real opportunity was, imagine if you were able to take that type of ecosystem and target some of its concentration and focus towards societal well-being. My God, the kind of change that you could possibly have, right? And so I've had the great pleasure of having very good leaders globally, as well as in India, who got that, right? Sometimes we think, doing good for society should come very naturally to everyone. It doesn't.
It doesn't.
Right? And it surprises me all the time that, people who have so much but do so little. But what I'm beginning to see, the culture of philanthropy, it's ingrained, as I think about cultures in our part of the world, it's ingrained in our ecosystem in some way or form.
Of giving back.
Of giving back. No, giving to neighbor, giving to, the extension of your village, giving to the temple, right? So we do giving, but it was just not structured in that way that societal giving has been defined in the Western context, right? So we have this great culture, but how do you make that more efficient? How do you make it more outcome-oriented? These are some of the things that we've tried to work on, especially as I think about PwC, because, even in India, 90% of our not-for-profit ecosystem is small and medium-sized institutions. And if you think about a world which is constrained on resources, constrained on finances, the model for development and humanitarian action in the future is going to be local capacity and capability. I don't want to be coming here 10 years later and sharing more knowledge. What I want to be doing is enabling and empowering local Nepali people who know their country much better than anybody else in the world will ever know it, right? Who are more interested and vested in the benefit and the growth of their country than anybody else will ever be. How do I empower and enable them more to take decisions on their own? And that's really speaking with a little bit of money and a lot of skill set exchange, right? So for us, I think in so many ways, it's about enabling and empowering local institutions so that they have the power of the right type of skills and sufficient levels of financing as they look for their own solutions for the future versus the historical parachute development of model. Somebody came from far away.
The colonial mindset. Yeah, let me just use this word.
Yeah, you said it. Takes 6 months to learn even, how to take the left turn outside of your office. That's just not efficient, right? And it's not the format that's going to work in the world which is constrained in the way that it is with resources, with the growing population. And such like. And
people having digital access to the world at the end of the day, because today YouTube is going to teach you, well, this is my personal opinion, a lot more after your college or after your high school. It's going to add, sprinkle a lot of ideas in your mind. Digital in general.
Absolutely. And self-learning, right? The power of digital and the way that it has turned the head on conventional educational systems is amazing. But even digital requires for a certain amount of transfer of knowledge to happen. You used that example very rightly, by the way, before we started, is, look, that teacher who all of a sudden you gave a tablet to, right, had never ever learned how to transfer knowledge through the tablet-based ecosystem.
Yeah.
So the first step is actually to be able to take the teacher through that hardware and software before you even take it to the student. But some institutions, individuals thought that just by giving somebody a smartphone, that education was going to start happening immediately. Yes, to some extent it would. But if you really want it to be efficient and you want it to be sustainable long term, you have to look at the whole ecosystem versus just
the larger
like
picture. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and on today's date, could you elaborate on this? I was reading up on PwC, and there was a word that constantly came up, which is called trust. At the end of the day, people have to have that amount of trust to even go ahead and believe that the person who is giving, or an entity that's giving money and skill set, do we trust them or not? Because at the end of the day, trust is the biggest thing anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
Somebody coming over and presenting a pocket full of money, I'm just going to add this, a pocket full of money, and then we'll give you the skill set, and then go ahead and create. A lot of people will hesitate.
Yeah.
That trust is definitely going to be there.
Yeah.
How do you mitigate within that trust?
I'll use two words. And it's amazing that you picked this up, because if you ask me what is one of the most defining factors of the sector that we're in, is trust. We're essentially in so many ways in the business of trust, because why would someone think that my opinion is important if two things, intent and time. So one of them is intent, right? You've got to be very clear about what is your fundamental intent, the reason for why you're doing what you're doing. Yeah. And one example I'll use there, which is what has a positive movement, I think a lot more can be done, but positive movement that's happened in the private sector is, look, till 10 years, 15, 20 years ago, the only value that we would speak about in the private sector would be shareholder value. But shareholders are one stakeholder in a private system or even in a listed company, right? You've got employees, you've got customers, and you've got your shareholders, right? And then, of course, all your suppliers and all of that stuff. So the stakeholder group is much larger. Today, you'll hear a lot more about stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism. That means I'm not just looking at, is everybody making the return, right? And the return is not only about the shareholder, but it's about the entire group of stakeholders which make up a particular private system. So coming back to it, intent. Why is it that you do what you do? And the second is time, right? Any trust. Whether it's, to some extent, two brothers, whether it's two business partners coming together, whether it's even within families, parents. And
or countries coming together.
All countries coming together, right? The interesting thing about trust is, in which everybody has heard often, to break it takes 2 seconds. To build it can take you years.
Forever.
Right? So I think there's a time equation which is associated with trust. If you don't, and one of the things that, at least in my own world, has been extremely important in the way that I've approached that same question is, typically when you looked at private sector philanthropy, it used to be very checkbook associated. I'd write a check, I'd give it to somebody came back to me with a report 6 months later.
A CSR.
Exactly. There's only one program, the Afghanistan program, and that I would have, of course, gone to unless there was the political instability which was on it a few years ago. But it's the only program out of all of our global humanitarian programs where I haven't gone and seen it before we started the program. And that's fundamental in terms of what I want to breed in how we do what we do in the not-for-profit space. It's about smelling, tasting, getting your hands dirty, and all the things that are required for you to understand context. If I don't understand the context of what that farmer that I keep speaking about in the Tarai is going through, and I cannot understand that context unless I smell it, I see it, I taste it, I feel it, right? If I don't understand that context, that person, that ecosystem has no reason to trust me. And the only way to do that is to go there at the starting point. And then you begin to start scratching the surface on trust. And I've seen this happen in India, where, of course, I've done a majority of the work that I've done. We're a beautiful, diverse society, right? So, I mean, what works in the north sometimes is not the same one-size-fits-all which will work in the east, right? Contexts are very different. And so you have to curate to that context. As soon as people see you spending time doing that, the little bubbling in the building of trust begins to happen. Like I said, to break it will be very easy, right? It takes very little to do that. But to build it and to sustain it, not just build it, but then you have to sustain it. To do that, that's a constant effort. That's a constant investment, not just of money, but of time.
Yeah.
And as you were quite rightly saying before we started today also, what are we most challenged with today? No matter the job you're in or the one that I'm in, right? Time. How do you give it enough time? So for me, by the way, one of the ways that I do that is that a lot of my site visits that I do into the field are on the weekend. And many people ask me, they're like, why don't you, don't you have anything better to do? Or don't you have anything more fun to do? And I said, look, the part of the reason that I do what I do is because I wouldn't call it fun, but what I consider meaningful in my life and what I consider, what I do professionally, there's a really fine line. And so for me, that line is blurred. When I'm in the field, in so many ways, I'm happiest.
Yeah.
So it's coming back to that point about self-interest, right? It makes me happy fundamentally. And the fact that that then has something meaningful that you're passing on to society, even better. Lucky me.
That's fulfilling, and that's fulfilling you, and that's something that's you're dedicated about it. You're dedicated about nonprofit. You're dedicated about going ahead and giving back to the society, regardless of wherever in the world.
And the only piece only piece I'll add to that is that there's no me, there's we. The only reason that I am able to even get or scratch the surface is because of the amazing people. My own team, the institution, the family, the friends ecosystem. If all of these things don't come together and are supportive, we wouldn't be able to do what we do, right?
It crumbles
very quickly.
Very quickly. I've come to realize that as well.
Exactly.
Unrecognized sectors, I know your time is very limited today, and I just want to go ahead and touch base on a few questions I had. Unrecognized sectors when it comes to development in Nepal.
Yeah.
You've been coming here for the past 8 years. Just a few pointers you'd like to go ahead and share with us. There are a lot of sectors that we still need to go ahead and work on.
Yeah. So I think, look, if you think about the private sector in Nepal, you have a pretty vibrant one, right? But it is in that space where it requires a certain level of maturity to happen very quickly. It goes back to that point that I was making earlier about time, right? 100 years ago, parts of the world that are more responsible for climate change than some other parts of the world had the time. We didn't have the data. We didn't know the downside. Today, we know the downside, and time is short. And so for me, the real concern, as I think about Nepal, is that transition, that maturity, and that foresight needs to happen far quicker across all of your sectors. Let me give you an example. Two of your most important sectors in some senses in Nepal are agri and tourism.
Yeah.
Both of them immensely impacted by a changing climate. So if I was to focus down on two places where the needle can move quickly, where the investments can be very pointed, and where the actions need to be taken in a far more bold manner, it would be the tourism and the agri sector. And there again, you have some amazing policy. You have some amazing institutions. And then, of course, you need the multilateral development banks. You need institutions like the UN. You need friendly neighbors, Western countries, everybody to take an interest in terms of being able to invest and provide the relevant technologies and the hand-holding that is needed, right? Because the skill set transfer is not going to happen unless you have hand-holding, which is based on effort. Money I'll give you. But how do I create enough capacity from a skill sets perspective so that as we think about the future, it's not that parachute form of development. The capability has been created locally. Now, this doesn't happen, unfortunately, with the click of a button. It requires sustained effort. So just to come back to that private sector adaptation report that we're launching along with CNI, it gives some very specific recommendations of the type of platform that needs to be created, the stakeholders that need to be a part of it, and the actions that those respective stakeholders need to take as we think about the important actions for the next 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. But the starting point is the collaborative platform. And the collaborative platform to have enough power in it, which is where I think the political side of it comes in. And that has to be, it can't be partisan. It's got to be bipartisan, right? I mean,
everybody has to come
everyone in the political sphere, because look, the good side will impact everybody. The bad side will impact everyone.
I'll come to the largest democracy in the world. When it comes to climate, I'll just put it in very layman's term. Everybody coming together on this in the largest democracy of the world?
So look, two things that I'm proud of. One is the amount of solar capacity that India has created in the last 6-7 years. Phenomenal. Is phenomenal.
Coal is still there.
Huh?
Coal is definitely still there.
Coal is definitely. We will still continue to use coal for a certain period of time.
Okay.
Because as you think about renewable transitions, you have to worry about the engines of economic growth as well, right? So you can't. It's not like I switch. Yeah, I wish you could do that, right? But you can't do that. So one is, the amount of solar capacity which has been created is a really good story. Is there much that still needs to be done? There is still much that needs to be done. The second piece is, we anchored something called the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure in India, CDRI. And it's a global, it's something that India started, but it has global participation as a part of it. And what does it really speaking mean? Yeah. As we think about extreme weather events being more frequent and more complex, what's going to get impacted? Basic infrastructure is going to get impacted, right? So how do you create the right platform, mechanisms, and actions as we think about protecting very critical infrastructure, whether that be your hospital, or whether that be the road that is your central road which provides all your supplies to a particular part of Nepal. We built roads, hydro infrastructure, cement plants. We built basic infrastructure in a particular way 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago because we didn't have these extreme weather events, right?
Back in the day.
Back in the day. Today, when you have those, the type of infrastructure that you need to create has to be far more resilient infrastructure.
For the next 100 years.
Correct. In a world which is resource constrained. So how do you create, so I think what India has done is to bring people together in the International Solar Alliance, which was, again, pioneered by the current government, and CDRI, which is another example of disaster resilient infrastructure, to bring best practices, to share, to collaborate, and then to be able to pass on that knowledge. This is not patented knowledge, right? This is knowledge that can be freely shared. And that's, in some senses, the core of what my general broad argument, across this conversation has been. There needs to be a lot more sharing of everything, right? And that sharing is only in our self-interest. I'm not saying this because you're giving something away. You might not see what you're getting back today. I can tell you in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years from now, you'll begin to see the worth of that sharing that we're doing today.
Fair enough. In time. Well, everything is going to be in time, right? I'm a big believer in the private sector. This is my personal opinion, because at the end of the day, society has to grow. People have to make money.
Absolutely.
People have to make money regardless of being a family or a publicly owned company. At the end of the day, you do business to make money. But there's a big but right here. I'm a big believer that if you're making money, then maybe, hopefully, if you go ahead and give a little bit of that for the fulfillment and the growth of the society, then more the merrier. CSR, that word, we've been hearing that. I've been hearing that since I was in school.
Yeah.
Now, well, today I heard the new word, ESG, right? Environment, social, and governance.
Yeah.
As we grow,
yeah.
We, meaning in Nepal, as we grow, even in the private sector, obviously there are going to be more industries coming down the road, agri, tourism, there might be hotels, there might be thousands of different things, hopefully lakhs and lakhs of industries coming, and majority of people trying to go ahead and start up a business, right?
Yeah.
What would you like to go ahead and say to somebody who is thinking of starting a business today? Yeah. And then the impact, hopefully, the impact that they're going to go ahead and give to Nepal, and then how can they go ahead and give back to the society?
Yeah. Look, and again, going back to that, most of your economy, as is the case for most developing economies, the small and medium-sized sector is the one that drives a large participation in terms of GDP, right? To use your point again, everything has to start from home, right? So if my lens in terms of when I'm starting a business is somewhat more societally associated, no matter what you do, whether you're selling a biscuit, right, or you're a contractor for a road, right? A subcontractor for a road. If you're able to, in some way or form, do your business modeling in a way that part of it actually goes towards broader societal good in your very small ecosystem, whether that's at the village level, at the block level, or at the city level. And everybody will have a different level of giving that they can do. What you can do, what I can do, what somebody outside on the road can do will be different levels. But how do you create a mindset that, look, we're in this together, we're all going to be impacted in the same way. And I can tell you that that person who's sitting on that mountaintop in GOHA, right, knows some of the things that they need to do for their own particular community.
Yeah.
What we sometimes urban dwellers don't realize is that there's far more sharing that happens there than here, right? So it's actually us. And the interesting thing is that if you think about the economic levers are, the controls are in the cities. Is in Kathmandu, is in Delhi, is in Washington, is in London, and all of those places. But so we keep talking about what are the formal systems we can create and impose on private institutions to give more. That's what we keep saying. I can tell you that the small and medium-sized guy, in his own way, is being efficient, and by being efficient is being climate sensitive to some extent. Where that comes together is that, look, if you want to deal with plastic, for example, as an issue, which is such a big issue, it doesn't matter who you are, plastic requires an ecosystem change. That means today you have innovations where you have materials which can be used like plastic, but they degrade much quicker as you put them into the environment. But for you to introduce that into the system requires for the price point to be right, requires for your input supply chains to be in the right place. And all of that stuff, by the way, can only be impacted by policy level action and for some of the big players to take that on. Otherwise, how do I expect that small and medium-sized person to take away from plastic? The person who's got the vendor shop, right, who's selling vegetables, for them, if plastic is the only thing that they're getting, because that's what the big industry is creating, right, they don't have any ability to change.
They don't have a choice.
Exactly, right? So the change needs to happen at both levels, mindset at all levels, but the big change needs to happen in some senses at the policy level and at the big player level, because they have the ability to cause scalable change to happen. But the mindset can change at the granular grassroots level.
After you said this, there's something that I just want to go ahead and touch base on. Kathmandu, the city that we're at the moment, the Kathmandu metropolitan city has decided that from the mid of December, if I'm not mistaken, from the mid of December, plastic, anything related plastics, tobacco products, you cannot sell them anymore.
Okay.
So there are two reasons of this. Of course, there are multiple, but I saw two major reasons for this. One, of course, the health impact. No shadow of a doubt on that. Second, obviously, pollution as well. Because the small little gutka packets that you go ahead and sell, of course, you're going to go ahead and enjoy the gutka, whatever, and then you're just going to throw it anywhere. It doesn't matter. Wherever you throw it, and you might want to put it in your pocket, it might just fall down. So in a span of another 15 days, so let's say by the end of December, and when we hit January, I kind of have a feeling that some of us are going to be slightly more healthier, and then the pollution's going to get the plastic pollution's going to get slightly less when it comes to that specific market of tobacco-related products, right? So that's an impact that I'm very eager to go ahead and see the impact that this change is going to go ahead and bring the policy level change.
And look at it. Who's the one that can cause for that to happen? It's only policymakers. Nobody else can put that hammer down, right? And look, again, it's not a switch off and a switch on button, right? So if they've started to do that with tobacco products, for example, and they begin to start, it's interesting you mentioned this. I'm trying to do something similar in one of our coastal projects where I'm dealing with solid waste management. Right? Waste is a big issue, no matter which part of the world you're in. And to make the people transition, I can't expect to make them transition and make them understand how bad plastic is without giving them an alternative. So what have we gone out and done? We are going out and looking at a cloth or a jute-based product, which we want to give to every family in a particular panchayat, in a particular village in this part of coastal India, and then go to the shops of which in that village there are maybe about 15, 20 of them, and give extra ones to them. I've made the investment. I think it's an important idea. Yeah. But if I don't go to them with the argument but also a solution, then I'm only ticking one side of the box. What policy can do really well is that they are making a big industry, tobacco's big industry. They are causing for change to happen at the industry level. That was the example I was using. If the big player doesn't change, downstream change is going to be hard. But the big player will only change when the hammer of policy comes through. Right? So there's a responsibility at all levels, and I'm by the way, I'm super pleased to hear that you're going to do this.
And in a span of a few months, as soon as I'm sure that we're going to go ahead and see changes. If the changes are drastic in a span of, let's say, a year, then probably India and the rest of the world can go ahead and learn something from us.
Absolutely right. Absolutely. I mean, I say this very often. Nepal holds a very special place in many hearts across the world, okay? And it has this ability to leverage its challenges and its opportunities as it creates an example for the world. And I truly do believe that it has a very big example that it can create because of the special place that it holds in so many people's hearts. So, I mean, I would very much want to be a part of that positive change. My commitment is solid. Hopefully, for the last 8 years and for the next 80, I would say, but I'm not that young. But yeah, it's positive to see some of this change. It's just that I say that we need far more of it.
I've got another 1,000 questions, but again, I've already got a text from Jaivir saying we got to go to meet the Prime Minister, so I have to let you go. But again, when I come back, I'll need another 3 hours. We're just getting started.
I'd be happy to. You've been too kind. I'm back here pretty much every second month, so I should be back in early of the next year.
Done. I'm gonna take at least another 2 to 2.5 hours, and then I'll be fulfilled. Just 2 more questions that I just want to go ahead and touch base on. Could you just elaborate? This is something which I wanted to understand. The Social Entrepreneur School collaboration with Nobel Bank, right?
Yes.
Could you elaborate a little bit on this, and then maybe I could help out, or our team can, and my company can help out in any way in this?
Absolutely. I mean, more the merrier, to use your words again. So the School for Social Entrepreneurs was originally a UK institution, was set up 20 years ago. PwC had a very old relationship with them in the UK. And then PwC India and helped incubate the institution in India. So we created the School for Social Entrepreneurs India. And essentially, the unique thing about the SSC is that it concentrates on the individual, not the enterprise. Mm-hmm. And the argument there is that, look, we want passionate people who we can, again, empower, enable with the right type of ecosystem and skills and mentorship and all those things. Mm-hmm. Because the person will always retain those skills. The enterprise, first one might fail, second one might do okay, third one might be amazing. Yeah. But what we want to do is concentrate on the individual, because it's that journey that we really want to be a part of. And so when I got the opportunity, I think the government of Nepal has a certain regulation for banks in Nepal, where they're supposed to do some priority sector lending for small businesses. And so the idea was that, can we use SSC in some senses to help Nabil create an ecosystem of entrepreneurs to whom they could lend to, right? But when with the lending would also be a transfer of skills and a particular type of skill sets and the ability to run an enterprise. So it's done pretty well. As I think about the last 2.5 years, I think that it's been around. Mm-hmm. I think it now has the ability to evolve and go into the next stage of transition. Mm-hmm. All of you, I mean, through your platform, and even you yourself, for some of the cohorts that go through that system, for them to hear your story, because your story is a very similar story. As I was going through even some of the people that you've interviewed before, so many of them have a social inclination, right? And so you're already a part of it in some senses. But to make it a more strategic part, I'd love to have that conversation with you the next time that we're together and see if we can do something formal, because I think the media, as I've mentioned on so many occasions in this conversation, the media has such a crucial role to play. We underestimate it. We don't use it enough. And again, I think, for so much of this has to be done by people who are in their youth at the moment.
Yeah.
We need to have some of our elders also be a part of that process. But the real reins of this are in the youth, in the people who understand the world as it is today and are going to be a part of the world 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. So, I mean, please, as you said, more the merrier. We'd love to have you be a part of that relationship, and I'd be happy to curate that.
Done. We'll definitely plan something. One last thing that I wanted to touch base on was obviously you're close with the CNI, and again, you guys are working together on this.
Yeah.
How do you think the approach is going to be this time around when we go ahead and catch up with our policymakers? Just again, in very layman's perspective,
Yeah.
Implementation-wise.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are going to be tons of points, tons of things that's going to be given. Implementation-wise, what do you expect? What's the outcome that's going to come out of this?
It's, again, interesting that you, in some senses, hit the nail on the head, right?
Not trying to put you on the spot again.
No. That's exactly why I'm here. Because part of what we have seen is that there's been lots of talk. There's solutions that are available. But what we're finding a problem with is to get the right people around the table to make the commitment towards action. And so my hope is that as I go to policymakers over the next couple of days, but also engage the private sector, that they commit to action. Because the report that I'm speaking of, which I hope to launch this evening along with CNI, the report has some very clear things that can be done in terms of action. Now, we'll have to pilot then to take to scale.
Yeah.
But the piloting element also will require financing, will require policy support, will require collaborative platforms to be created within the private sector. And that's why we went to the industry body, because the industry body is most respected, has the most amount of trust as you think about the private sector in Nepal, right? So it was very important to have a cohesive narrative as you went to all private sector. And so my hope is that as we go to policymakers in Nepal, that they will commit to the action piece of it. We can come and assist in how that will happen, right? And invest into some of it as well. But the real push needs to come from the policymakers and from industry bodies and from the private sector in Nepal. So my hope is that as I think about the next 2, 3, and 6 months, we create actionable pilots of the kind of examples in climate adaptation, like I've been speaking about with you. We create actionable examples of action that has been taken by particular sectors along with policymakers, which then have the ability to scale. We got to create the examples, because otherwise I'm only talking theory, right? And we've got enough theory going, we need it to come into practice.
And implement it and make sure that we see the results so that the next generation can go ahead and maybe bear some fruit of it.
Spot on.
Thank you so much for your time, and I know you have to bounce, but next time around I'll take 3 hours and then do a couple of more hours, and then
I have a whole day for you.
I love picking brains of smart people. So that's why I started this podcast, so thank you so much for coming.
You're too kind. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Awesome.